All right, I am now joined by C. Derick Varn, um, you know, formerly of Zero Books, multiple
Yeah.
years there, but you can find him on Varn Vlog on YouTube, and he is also a poet. So, how are you doing today?
I'm well. We're talking about my favorite reactionaries, and uh, this is a time period though where it's a little bit harder to call Hitchens an out and out reactionary. It's
Hmm.
that transition period between the middle '90s and his full blown conversion to quasi neoconservatism. But
Yeah, no, that's definitely right. I mean, I think the '90s in general are kind of a weird transitional fossil for Christopher's evolution. Um, there's certainly the like beginning of the bad foreign policy views. Like pre 9/11 era comes with the wars of the former Yugoslavia. But like this 1999 is when this debate is that we're about to watch, which is the same year that his Clinton book comes out. It's actually my favorite Hitchens book.
yeah, the Clinton
No
book's
one,
good actually.
yeah, no
Uh,
one left to lie to. Yeah, no, it's very good. Like really, like I mean, it's definitely at the height of his powers as a writer, and it's just this really like savage, left critique of the Clinton administration, and actually oddly focused on domestic policy for a Christopher Hitchens book. I think it might be the only one that's quite that focused on that.
mhm.
Um, but even there, right? Like it's a fantastic book, but the Iraq chapter of that book, I mean, is one little preview of what's coming, right? That he um, that like if anything, like he'd opposed the first Gulf War, but since then he'd spent time in Iraqi Kurdistan and I think local leaders there. I mean, this is what our friend Gene Bajalan always tells me, that like what I sort of give my like view from 10,000 feet like analysis of like what happened to Christopher Hitchens. He's like, yeah, that's all kind of true, but like also um he'll like name specific Iraqi Kurdish leadership figures, like, yeah, these people were '70s radicals. They could speak to Hitchens in his own language, and they were
Mm.
very convincing, right? That was a big part of what happened, and along with Bosnia. And so even the Iraq chapter of No One Left to Lie To is very like it's not it's not really what you'd expect given what the rest of the book is about, right? If anything, it's more about like Bill Clinton letting Saddam Hussein off easy. Um, so there are signs of what's coming, and even in this debate we're about to watch, like formally Christopher's position in the debate is very very left wing in most ways, but also the position that he's arguing for is like essentially, I mean, they talk about a lot of different things in this debate, and I don't want to oversimplify too much, but like it's essentially remain, right, on the Britain and the EU question, and his enthusiasm for like the EU, I think sits a little oddly with how radical some of the things that he says in the debate sound on the surface, and also like I think he sort of throws in a couple of extraneous references to Yugoslavia, like that sort of show like how much space that's taking up in his head. Like he'll say things like you know so I did talk to Peter Hitchens in like a crossover thing with the Popular Pod, and he didn't like that I was referring to his position in 1999 as like proto Brexit, because of course, because he doesn't like the actual like move towards Brexit, because of course he doesn't, because he doesn't like anything, like so.
Right.
But he was certainly at least very opposed to Britain being in the EU, and there are a couple of points in the debate, I think, where Christopher refers to people who have that position as wanting Britain to be an offshore Serbia.
It is interesting given what's happened in the interim. I mean, both with Hitchens' death and um, where his politics would lie later. Uh, it's hard to say actually if he would have stayed such a fan of the EU.
Mm-hmm.
Basically a proto remainder before it was a thing. It's also unclear to me. I mean, I know, I too have I had interesting exchanges with Peter Hitchens. I did an entire podcast on him once where he complimented me for calling him a reactionary for the right reasons. So,
Yeah, no, I mean, he is crazy reactionary. Like not not racist in any way that I can tell, but like crazily reactionary in a more sort of general like really fundamental way. Like an actual quote from that discussion referred to is, I suppose you probably think Margaret Thatcher was a conservative.
yeah, I mean, we're talking about a person who basically anything after the 17th century is going to be liberal no matter what position it is, and so. I mean, what's remarkable about Peter Hitchens, is his grumpiness, which I kind of appreciate, and that he has tried to be consistent. One of the things that's been interesting,
Mm-hmm.
is watching him navigate now the Trump Johnson period, because there are more elements of paleoconservatism which he would technically be theoretically aligned with in their agenda, and he still hates it, and he's got, I mean, his reasons for hating it actually are consistent,
Mm-hmm.
but it is kind of hilarious.
Yeah.
And so going back to this time when they're both kind of out of sync, because Christopher's out of sync with the Clinton consensus basically, and Hitchens is out of sync with. It's actually in this time it's hard to tell how out of sync he actually is with the Tories, because Toryism hadn't really completely, for lack of a better word, Americanized like it would a few years later. But it does feel like he's not totally in step with the way the Tories were going in response to New Labour. So it is interesting in that they're both in kind of a transition period, and they're both kind of out of sync with the mainstream of their respective positions. But it's going to be interesting to watch this again, because I think people are much more familiar with the later debate, which I think happened like 7-8 years later.
Yeah. Well, like 9, I guess, but yeah,
9,
whatever. Yeah, it's like 2008 in down the street actually in Grand Rapids. So yeah, which is a really interesting debate. Like I will say, like we've watched both halves of that on here before, and it's like
like half of it you're siding with one side, and then immediately when they change topics you're like, wait, no, I'm on the other side now. Like
yeah, totally. Like in the God half of the debate, like you really see, like, because this is the sort of like core of Peter's like deeply right wing view of the world. I mean, like which I will say, like I read his book. Well, I tried to read his book, the Cameron Delusion, and it's just like it's sort of, I don't know. It's like the worldview of like I guess like smarter version of like American affairs mixed with like stuff that post leftists say on Twitter, and like and I had a hard time, getting through that much of it. But I did read all of his book, The Rage Against God, which is sort of his response. It's not exactly a response to God is not great. Parts of it are, but I mean it's a book that I think he wrote because Christopher had written God is not great, and it's a lot of it's really a memoir, and but like you really see his worldview on there display, which roughly speaking, I don't think this is very much of a caricature of what he thinks, which is that, okay, you can't really have any evidence for or against the existence of God, but you should take a leap of faith, not for like personal spiritual reasons so much as because like social order depends on like
right.
moral enforcement.
But we need the ground of being of some sort of religious code for social order to be emergent for Hitchens, which also like, and superficially a lot of the stuff he does, like his ideas about markets and stuff, sounds like socialism. It's with the kind of current, post left, anti-left talking points. However, if you know the tradition of Catholicism that he's coming out of, none of this is surprising. I mean, he's basically arguing for distributism and like corporatist statism, which is, class collaboration, where each class has their role as defined by basically God, and has a responsibility of taking care of the other peoples to make sure they can do their role, which is, a nice sentiment.
Sure.
Reality didn't work that way and never has, but
Right.
but that is his political view. Like, so,
yeah, I mean, he's a, right. I mean, he's an Anglican, but I think a very
he's an
theologically
Anglo-Catholic
sort of Anglican. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's definitely that's definitely right. I mean that. Yeah. Right. He's a Anglican the way like T.S. Eliot was an Anglican.
right.
So to answer your question, Darius, right now it was released as a Patreon episode. I was thinking about unlocking it and like running it instead of like a live interview for the first real episode of January. Not 100% sure about that, but you can definitely find it there. But yeah, I mean, it's yeah. So I think Peter like would never. I mean, there is this funny line in Hitch 22 where Christopher says that he could imagine, Peter is an atheist but not a Catholic. But I mean, I think that's like more of a nationalist thing than a theological one.
Right, exactly. Because his theology to me has always struck me like he's basically a Catholic, but he's not a Catholic, and that's really important. But he's basically a Catholic. Like in the way that I will often say that, like, Richard Dawkins is basically a liberal Anglican prig who just gave up on God. Like Hitchens is an Anglican who gave up on the Pope, but
right.
but not anything else of the Catholic Church. So it's an interesting. It's interesting to see him go into rages. It's also interesting to remember, however, that both he and Christopher were at one time Trotskyists, both of them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think he goes renegade way earlier, but like I believe in the early 70s or late 70s.
Yeah, I think sometime in the 70s. I mean, I did. Yeah, so I think that's right, because I think by sometime in the 80s he was like very well. I mean, in some ways, I think his own his foreign policy progression is very much like some like American paleocons who were like, who were like very interventionist in the 80s because they were anti-communist, but who in the period after the Cold War, sort of, especially with the invasion of Iraq, started to sour, on interventionism for like right-wing isolationist kinds of reasons.
Take Pat Buchanan, take away the racial obsessions and add religious obsessions, and you have basically Hitchens' general orientation if translated to an American context. I mean,
yeah, no, that seems about right. And in fact, they even both wrote books, like sort of revisionist narratives about World War II books, which that it wasn't really a necessary war, etc. Although I will say, again, maybe I just have too much of a soft spot for him. But in Buchanan's case, I have a hard time not suspecting that that's partly motivated by sympathy for the other side. In Peter's case, I actually do think like he actually does seem to have, even though it's sometimes a weird fit with his nationalism and sometimes they point in different directions, he does seem to have like a genuinely like kind of like humanistic revulsion about wars that like you do see like in that the Iraq part of his debate with Christopher. Like I remember watching that and thinking it's like, okay, I mean he's saying some very like over the top conservative things because he's a he's somebody with over the top conservative beliefs, but I think through that ideological prism, I think he was like some of what he says about like kind of his visceral disgust with how flippantly people were talking about the drive for war in Iraq. I think in a weird ultra conservative way, I think he actually did find his way to having like a sort of correct human reaction to what was going on there.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about Hitchens, and one of the things, like when I was talking about his celebrated grumpiness,
Yeah.
and both of them are grumps, but Peter even more so, is that there is a consistency there that if you once you realize the first principles, and I've known a lot of like people who would now consider post leftists who are very sympathetic to Peter Hitchens. And I would say, yeah, but you don't share his first principles. So for you, this is ad hoc, you see something where you like the results. Peter Hitchens really is operating off of a worldview of like, he's anti-war because, in some ways, the social institutions are based off of the emergence of belief, and in some ways, in a way that you can trace all the way back to someone like Joseph de Maistre, which I don't think Hitchens would own up to, but even the way the governments fail are manifestations, are
Sure.
you might think that they're like ways of God showing you that like you've screwed up, but that the social order is basically what it's supposed to be. And that's because he's so oppositional to contemporary politics. That assumption about the social order is missed. But like he's a Burkean. He calls himself a Burkean conservative. I actually think he's more conservative than that, because I mean the Burkean conservatives, for example, yes, they were technically religious, but their argumentations were actually that social progress has to just be really slow, and it has to be in dialogue with the past. Like they basically supported Burke supported the American Revolution. I can't see if you transplanted Peter Hitchens to the same time period that he would have been a Burkean conservative Whig. He would have been like an uber royalist or something.
No, that seems completely right. I will say that when you were talking about you bring up the Joseph de Maistre thing earlier, I actually was thinking about Burke, because I think that like one of Burke's, I mean, other than supporting the American Revolution, which it's a hot take on the left in 2021, but I mean, I basically think bourgeois democratic revolutions were good things. But but other than that, I think that Burke's best thing is that he was actually like initially, I mean, obviously his nationalism got the better of him, when Indians started fighting back, but he was initially hostile to like incursion into India, like on sort of ultra traditionalist conservative grounds that that you're like disrupting the order of that society.
Yeah, I mean, I've been recently doing explainers on anti-imperialism, and one thing that I'm about to do an explainer on is the history of conservative anti-imperialism going back to Burke. And I do think that is because they had this view that, well, the societies are backwards because God made them that way, and you should leave them alone, which from our standpoint is like half of that statement is useful.
Yeah.
The other half
you're
is terrifying.
Getting it from this horrible starting point. Yeah. No, exactly. All right. Well, we should probably start. Oh, actually, last thing I would say is that just credit where credit's due. Also, like The Rage Against God is a really good book. I mean, and like as like a an atheist and however squishily a Marxist, I obviously could not be further from the worldview that's expressed in it. But like I try to read at least a couple of conservative books a year, just to kind of keep myself honest and make sure I'm engaged with what people actually think and not something I made up in my head. And usually it's a chore, but it's like, no, that one, like he's a good writer. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like an emotionally effective book.
Rage Against God is a good book. It's actually interesting because I kind of think it's a better book than God is Not Great, but not a better book than Hitch 22.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's um particularly I laugh every time I get to God is Not Great, where um Hitchens actually makes a paleo-conservative argument about Trotskyism being a religion,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah,
it,
yeah.
like, widens the category of religion to, like, any false belief in anything
Yeah.
whatsoever. So
I mean,
it's
I am very fond of parts of God is Not Great. Like, I think it's a well written book. I mean, look,
it's the best. I actually would say it's the most readable of the three major of the Four Horsemen books. I
uh,
think Dennett's book is actually the best of them, but it's not the
uh,
easiest to read.
uh,
I think the God Delusion's a mess, actually, and like the longer you're away from it, you go back and read chapters about, like, memes and biological evolution of solar systems, and you're just like, um and then the Sam Harris book is fine on its religious arguments, but like all the problematic politics that people find in him now, they were there from the beginning if you read that book closely. So
yeah.
um
No, I think so, and I should say too. I mean, like Terry Eagleton, being a Christian and B having obviously had much better politics than Christopher Hitchens had at that point. It's like a naturally very unsympathetic reader, but like there's a in his book, I don't remember what it's called. But it's like something. The subtitle's like Reflections on the God Debate or something. It's like basically Eagleton's like anti-new atheist book, and in
mhm.
there, he even has a line where he's like, uh, he had like throughout the book, he pretty much clubs together, Hitchens and Dawkins as the people he's argued with, and I don't remember what it is. He's got some clever combination of their names that he's using, but he even has a line in that book where he says, "Look, before I go too much further, I should say that the two of them are different in at least one way. I really enjoyed reading God is Not Great. It's like you know this good lively writing, blah blah blah. And, you can't really say that about the God Delusion, which which seems you know I don't know. I think that um, I think Dawkins is probably a better writer than I sometimes give him credit for, at least when he's writing about biology. But um, I also think that like sometimes when he's like really self righteous about something, the writing suffers, and also yeah, I mean, what
Yeah,
you
I would.
said, yeah.
If people are going to read Dawkins, they should read The Ancestor's Tale or The Selfish Gene. The two
Uh,
books, the two books that I will say are actually science.
yeah,
And maybe if you want to read his atheist polemic, is actually his better one as The Blind Watchmaker, like
right, because
which
it's still basically about biology. So
right,
yeah,
and it's also super limited in scope, whereas like God is Not Great is all over the place. And it's weird though, as we start this now,
yeah.
it is strange how far away we feel from the new atheist debates of only 10 years. When I was thinking about that, because I was like, oh, that Hitchens v. Hitchens debate, that was, I guess 12 years ago. But man, it feels like it was like 2 decades or more ago. I guess it's like a decade and a quarter ago, but still, it feels
No,
longer than that
it
ago.
feels much longer ago than it was, which I have. And I should say, God is Not Great. I think it's a well written book. I enjoyed reading it.
Mm.
Uh, like recently reading it, to write mine, but also completely agreed. Like his attempts to deal with all the obvious like counterexamples about secular authoritarianism is super sketchy. And the arguments, yeah, some of the arguments are good, but like whenever he's like tried to rationalize his view in the face of stuff like that, it's really bad. But I think that my take on why the new atheist stuff feels so distant is that even though like okay, religion is is probably a human constant that's always going to exist, and hence so are people losing their religion, and that's always going to be a topic that interests people. But I think new atheism was really about, like, that Four Horsemen moment was really about sort of politically putting atheism at the center of the culture war. And I think that just doesn't feel relevant anymore in the same
Yeah.
way,
Well,
because
it doesn't have any political consequences when you think about it, because I mean, look at where most of Four Horsemen went, and then actually, if you look at where most of the atheist movement actually did go, it didn't all go into the alt-right like it's often
no.
parodied. They mostly became really obnoxious liberals.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I mean, to be honest, and thus, like, so the whole thing about God being center, are the atheism being centered, just seems like, well, it doesn't actually, it's not that predictive of politics, which was my critique at the time. Is like, well, yeah, like we could actually hold atheist positions and still probably come up with almost, you couldn't be Peter Hitchens,
Right.
which I guess is why we should start this. But like,
Yeah,
you couldn't
yeah.
be Peter Hitchens, but you can be almost everything else.
No, exactly. Like, yeah, you could for sure, be a right-wing libertarian. You could for sure be a neocon warmonger. You could for
You could be
sure
a
be
fascist too. I mean, like, all those are
sure.
options secularly. Like,
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, no, that was also my grumpy thing at the time. But I mean, I think my take is basically the reason that new atheism made sense culturally in 2009 and it does not now is, and it still sort of exists, but it's a shadow of its former self, is, and most of its leading adherents have, like, gone on to shift their emphasis to other things, is that in, like, basically, okay, I guess by 2009 Obama was president, but, like, basically this is the Bush era, and that's an era when the conservative side of the American culture war was just thoroughly identified with with evangelical Protestantism, basically.
mhm.
And that's what people on the liberal side of the culture war, like, that's what they were really afraid of, was like, theocracy, basically. And so, yeah, that's an era where it makes sense. This stuff was just super prominent, that, like, you know, Bill Maher, who was more popular, back then, talked about it all the time. Like, Family Guy would have jokes about, Brian, reading The God Delusion. Um, Whereas now, even though in a sense, that the uh, evangelical Protestantism is still very central to a lot of
Yeah.
right-wing politics on the ground, it's not really front and center in the way that most people perceive politics most of the time now. I mean, like, if nothing else, like, the last Republican president was somebody who did not put a lot of effort into pretending about that.
Right. I mean, well, it is interesting because if you look at polls, evangelicals are more wedded to one party now than they've ever been, but they're also they're actually a smaller part of even the Republican coalition. Like,
Yeah,
they've just declined, like, rapidly, um, in since 2008, and it's hard to know if new atheism actually played a role in that, or if it's other social forces, broader social forces that were actually at play, and so.
yeah.
Yeah.
My suspicion's always the second one, but who knows? All
Mhm.
right, we should.
Let's
Yeah,
let's
we should
go.
actually start. Yep.
May be. The format is pretty straightforward. Peter's going to talk for less than 20 minutes to tell you the essence of his argument. He will then be cross-examined by Christopher for a few minutes. Christopher will then deliver his own 10 minutes or so. He will then be cross-examined by him for a few minutes, and then you will all pile in. The only thing I would ask you when you all pile in is, let's try and keep to sort of subject by subject rather than drift all over the place all the time. So I'm not going to get involved, well, at least as little as possible. It's down to you to do the work this evening. But let's try and keep not necessarily order in the sense of I don't mind if you heckle or shout. Indeed, if you heckle and shout, that's absolutely fine.
It makes C-SPAN watchable.
Not bad. Can you get rid of him immediately? Right, Peter.
Ladies and gentlemen, and of course, comrades. There always used to be comrades, and here in Conway Hall there are certainly plenty of ghostly comrades unable to tear themselves away from the earthly struggle, soup-stained, bearded characters haunting the place which they used to inhabit when they were alive. Actually, people up there are alive. What can I say? The other thing I'd like to say at this meeting this evening is that it's totally unlike the launch of Britain in Europe, which was announced that it was patriotic to want to abolish your own country. Everybody has been allowed in. There was no list of people, as there was at that event, who were to be excluded on the grounds that they had the wrong opinions. A sign of the direction in which our country is moving, and rather a serious one. I'd also like to make an announcement. Any of you who are feeling cold should blame the Evening Standard and Times newspapers, which have jointly spread the vile calumny that I am opposed to central heating, thus encouraging the management, the economically minded management of the Conway Hall to switch off theirs. Thanks to another misunderstanding about my attitude to food, gristle canapes, cold, greasy mutton sandwiches, slabs of suet pudding with cool custard on, and thick white cups of very strong brown tea will be served at the end of the meeting. They are compulsory, just as such things were in my young day at a strict regime boarding school on the edge of Dartmoor. Count yourself lucky there's no lukewarm free school milk as well, thanks to Mrs. Thatcher. Some of you may wonder why we have decided to hold this debate. Well, first of all, we needed to quash once and for all some damaging rumors about us. We were, it was alleged, never seen together in public. We were both corpulent and spoke in the same plummy baritone. Neither of us seemed capable of doing up our top shirt buttons, so exposing alarmingly similar hairy chests. And we could impersonate each other on the telephone. Could it be, asked the cynics, that we were really one and the same person having an elaborate joke? Now, this idea was, of course, unbearable to both of us. And after an emergency summit in which we drew lots for the harder task, I embarked on a diet composed mainly of kippers and cabbage and became less fat. And the strategy would have succeeded had not Christopher ruined everything by writing what appeared to be an attack on that liberal hero, Bill Clinton, making some people think that he was right-wing. There were even suggestions that he might be about to launch an attack on the sacred Nelson Mandela, like the one which he had already made on poor old Mother Teresa. And so this suggestion that we were the same person must be quashed, and we are, as you can see and bear witness, both here in the flesh, more in his case than mine, and at once. I could have said. And we disagree profoundly on the great central issues of our times, which we are here tonight to debate, with perhaps a little Goethism thrown in from time to time. Now, my brother doesn't like Britain. That is to say, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. He thinks that surrendering the Irish portion of our country to the IRA is more or less a good move. He proclaims loudly that he is a citizen of something called the European Union. He expresses an enthusiasm for Tom Paine, as if this country was still ruled by Hanoverian kings and their placemen. In this, he is at least open and honest about his intentions and his views. Our current government, which in an illiterate and clumsy way shares his goals and views, do not have either the courage or the honesty to say so. They smile and they lie, rather than admit to being the destructive radicals they actually are. They don't like Britain because they don't feel comfortable in it. The brighter of them don't like Britain because it makes nonsense of every radical and socialist political theory ever invented. It is a monarchy, yet it is free. As a potent system, yet all may rise to the top of it. It has no written constitution, yet functions far better than many countries which do. It is capitalist, yet astonishingly uncorrupt and blessed with a social conscience. It was an empire, yet is not hated by most of its former subjects. In a socialist world, it simply oughtn't to exist. But rather than abandon the secular religion of socialism, the British left, in their classically idealist way, would prefer to abolish the country that so defies their worldview by the mere act of existing. And now, after 2 centuries in which the fact and idea of Britain seemed all but indestructible, their opportunity has come. And this, I believe, explains my brother's willingness to be in the same room as Princess Tony Blair and sometimes say nice things about him, even though the princess is exactly the kind of empty, witless creep that Christopher would normally avoid at all costs.
Say what you think.
The title of this debate, Let's Abolish Britain, is of course not my view, but it seems to me to sum up the jaunty and almost careless way in which the left, and especially Christopher, view the demolition of our country. And I've just touched on the origins of this strange desire. First, I'd like to make a small personal point in answer to so many questions. How is it, some of you may ask, that the two of us should take such fiercely opposed positions when we are brothers? All kinds of explanations occur. Many of them are sub-Freudian drivel of the sort resorted to by people when they don't like someone or can't understand what they say and cannot imagine that their actions or their thoughts have any good or decent motives. The truth is that we, though definitely not the same person, do have something very important in common. We both have independence of mind. Who knows why? Our unlikely but actually very British ancestry, West Country nonconformists on one side, Jewish refugees from Prussian militarism on the other, and heaven knows what else beyond, though no Iroquois as far as I know, may offer a clue. The independent mind instinctively revolts against conformism, whether imposed by fashion, as ours is, or naked authority, as it probably eventually will be again if things carry on going as they are. Nor are two independent minds necessarily going to be attracted by the same ideas, although they are likely to be repelled quite frequently by the dishonest, the conformist, and the banal, or so I like to think. We are, in fact, closer than we appear, and closer than we would like to confess. Our shared loathing and contempt for the pitiful clown who occupies the White House, contempt which long predates the Lewinsky affair, is not an accident, but a sign of a shared dislike for a certain kind of unprincipled fraud which transcends ordinary political positions. It may even be that some of the things I say this evening appeal to some of you on the left, though you wouldn't care to admit it to yourselves or your friends, because if you did, you'd never eat polenta and sun-dried tomatoes in this town again. Trained counsellors will be available in confidence at the back of the hall after the meeting for anyone who suffers any such qualms. You'll be able to identify them by the baseball caps. And now to Britain and its abolition, only a few years off, unless I can stop it with or without the aid of the Kensington and Chelsea Conservative Association. There used to be in our house, during our childhood, a thin book containing a longish poem by an American, Alice Duer Miller, called The White Cliffs. It was popular here and in the USA during the early, deadly dangerous years of the Second World War, because of its role in reminding Americans of their links with Britain and British people of their links with America. And this was despite the strong resentment which many Americans felt towards a country they still viewed as snobbish, narrow, and haughty. It is now forgotten. I cannot, alas, find it in any lumber room or garden shed, and only these lines of it remain at all well known. I am American bred. I have seen much to hate here, much to forgive. But in a world where England is finished and dead, I do not wish to live. The point was that England, as Britain was too readily known then, stood for a certain set of values which were treasured by all free peoples. The country did have its faults, but in spite of them, perhaps even because of some of them, it had been able to give the world ideas, customs, traditions, poetry, liturgy, scripture, understanding, law, reason, tolerance, valor, generosity, and in that year of 1940, hope. Yes, this was the country of the workhouse and the Irish potato famine and the Amritsar massacre, but it was also the country from which had come the ideas which created the United States of America and which had repeatedly sustained freedom against its many enemies. Something similar comes to mind if you read George Orwell's account of his turmoil at the same moment of our history. He, like Alice Duer Miller, had seen much to hate. In fact, nobody hated the British establishment of its time with more genuine bile than Orwell. And yet, even as he railed against the beetroot-faced hanging judge, who symbolized so much of what he thought was wrong about Britain, he recognized that this fearsome and in some ways repulsive character was also utterly incorruptible. And he recognized that this country was, though full of unfairness and division, a family which he believed had the wrong members in control. Writing as Britain waited naked for invasion in the winter of 1940, he was full of utter contempt for his fellows on the left who would not join the national struggle. Thanks to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, many British socialists did not join the war effort, and some actively sought to sabotage it. It was his disgust for them which caused him famously to make the remark, which is the key text of my book, £15 at all leading booksellers. England, he said, is perhaps the only great country whose intellectuals are ashamed of their own nationality. In left-wing circles, it is always felt there is something slightly disgraceful in being an Englishman, and that it is a duty to snigger at every English institution, from horse racing to suet pudding. It is a strange fact, but it is unquestionably true that almost any English intellectual would feel more ashamed of standing to attention during God Save the King than of stealing from a poor box. When he wrote those words, the intellectuals were a tiny and unimportant group, lost in the remote world of literature and scholarship. In the decades after the war, when the country was struggling to recover from damage, poverty, and disruption, those intellectuals were to enormously increase their influence in the civil service, in parliament, the universities, the schools, but above all in broadcasting. Their strength in these places was partly due to the great expansion of bureaucracy and state education during the war and after it, partly to what I see now as a loss of nerve and a failure of courage on the part of those who used to run this country. For many years, the supposed establishment of the ruling class had not really believed in the things which they professed to believe in and which once made our country so unique. They'd sneered in secret at the Christian faith, which they felt was something for the servants, and they thought themselves too clever and sophisticated to be ruled by something as medieval as a monarchy. They despised, in private, faithful lifelong marriage, constancy, and continence. The First World War, meanwhile, had swept away many of those who would have kept faith with the past. These, in all classes, were those who were volunteered first for the battle and who were most swiftly and thoroughly eaten up in the great cannibal meat grinders at Ypres, the Somme, Loos, and Passchendaele. The betrayal of the British common people in 1916 did terrible damage to patriotism and faith. The devastation of the old governing class did similar damage to the strength and self-confidence of the elite. The influence of the intellectuals during the early years of the Second World War was, thank heaven, small, or we should have lost it. But the war itself made these people much more important. And the war had not made them stop despising their own country. Their enthusiasm for the battle only began when Hitler betrayed his great ally, Stalin, and invaded Russia. Retrospectively, they sought to discredit the behavior of conservative, patriotic Britain between 1939 and 1941. The fantasy that the left had always taken a strong line on Hitler while the Tories were secretly hoping for an alliance with National Socialism was widely spread and is still widely believed. And people who hold to this view are still surprised to learn the grubby truth that, for instance, in 1934, a year after Hitler came to power, the Labour-supporting Daily Herald denounced the national government's modest white paper setting out the first steps to rearmament as an insult to Germany. That the Labour Party in Parliament voted against the expansion of the Air Force, which just in time led to its equipment with Spitfires and Hurricanes. That Labour in Parliament actually voted against military conscription in April 1939 after the German army had occupied Prague. I mention these facts not to defend Neville Chamberlain or Stanley Baldwin from the charges made against them, that one was fooled by Hitler and that one was too afraid of pacifism on one hand and the Treasury on the other to rearm in time. These charges, in my opinion, are proved. I simply want to demolish the myth that the left was interested in defending this country for its own sake before 1941. It was already disloyal, and its eventual support for the war would be based on Soviet patriotism, not British. The left had objected to rearmament. Why? Because it claimed to fear that the weapons would be turned on the Soviet Union. Its foreign policy was to seek alliance with that Soviet Union, which would have required appeasement of Stalin instead of appeasement of Hitler. And I don't quite see how buying peace by handing Stalin Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia would have been morally superior to buying it from Hitler by handing him the Sudetenland or Poland, or frankly, much more reliable. Then something momentous happened. Just as a war for national survival against Republican France destroyed the radical left in Britain's Napoleonic era, a war for the survival of European liberty, the Cold War, but a war nonetheless, sent the left scuttling to the margins of politics, from the Berlin airlift all the way up to the fall of the Berlin Wall. During the years of the Cold War, serious radical leftism was rightly, in my view, kept away from government power, especially from foreign policy, except that is in the Secret Intelligence Service, where Kim Philby and a band of others kept the Anglo-Soviet flame of friendship alive and were subsequently apologized for and excused by many in the cultural elite who would never even have have shared the same postal district with anyone who'd spied for the Nazis. But during this time, the great expansion of the full-time intelligentsia continued. The end of the war was the beginning of the growth of higher education and broadcasting, even taxpayer-funded art, in which the ideas of Bloomsbury, which Orwell had so much despised, flourished. At the same time, the waning powers of British patriotism, once sustained by empire and military success, faded, leaving many vacuums at the top of society. No conspiracy was necessary, and none took place. The new took the place of the demoralized and apparently discredited old. The left came to power in the education industry, in the civil service, in local government, in the arts, in the churches, above all in television. It even came to power in the Conservative Party, which operated for years as the Labour Party with one, well, lung, and is now struggling with itself to recover its principles. During the puzzling, double-edged period of Thatcherism, the new establishment were almost visibly enraged that they did not control the government. They ran everything else. Why not that too? Oddly enough, Mrs. Thatcher, for reasons explained in my book, eventually helped them into power. The end of the Cold War gave the left their greatest chance. Suddenly, for the first time in a century, it seemed safe to give the left, the anti-British, Republican, intolerant, liberty-disliking Committee of Public Safety left that had been held in check, mainly by working-class patriotism for so long, it gave them true power. This was not the 1945 Labour Party, whose trade union supporters were more British than anybody in this room. It truly was a new Labour Party, a party of Bloomsbury morals, against family and tradition, against our national history, against the Northern Irish Protestants, suspicious of the United States, not because of its radicalism, but because of its conservatism. And above all, it grasped, even if it didn't understand, that the European Union was the foe of the United Kingdom, and the two could not coexist for long upon the same patch of soil. So they chose, with unerring instinct, to support it. Here was a new anti-British supranational state with which they could fall in love, ruled by an unelected Politburo called the Commission, bolstered by a central committee known as the Council of Ministers, and adorned with a fraudulent Supreme Soviet called the European Parliament. When it began planning to launch its own ruble as well, their delight knew no bounds. They wanted to be in it, and I think they were wrong. I think they've been wrong for years. I think they have made a terrible mistake, even by their own lights. This is not a perfect country, never has been, never will be. It now makes shameful conquest of itself, but it has been better, both for its own citizens and for the world, that it existed at all. The nation state, in my view, is the largest and best unit in which it is possible to be unselfish to any real effect. To throw it away is to destroy much more than a flag and a name. Without it, and increasingly we are without it, vital things die. Civility, family, morality, language, restraint, kindness. Some months ago, I suffered a nearly Kerstlerian coincidence. I'd spent the day exploring a dismal and hopeless housing estate where almost feral children of 12 and 13 roamed in criminal gangs. My attempt to interview them had ended with one of them hurling a stone with considerable accuracy and force at my head. On my way... You see what they like?
Don't be like
See what
that.
they know where to put the razor blades in the potato. They always did. On my way home, I turned off the main road to visit the lonely church near Hardwick Hall where Thomas Hobbes is buried. And as I drove rather gloomily away from this spot, I switched on the car radio to hear a recording of W.H. Auden, who's not on the mobile phone, I take it. W.H. Auden reading these lines from The Shield of Achilles, which seemed to me to prophesy the meaningless, history-free, immoral and cultureless wilderness which we have created for ourselves through the abolition of all we have and are. Let me just read them to you. A ragged urchin, aimless and alone, loitered in that vacancy. A bird flew up to safety from his well-aimed stone. That girls are raped, but two boys, knife a third, were axioms to him who'd never heard of any world where promises are kept or one could weep because another wept. Thank you. Well done.
All right.
I am struck about the difference between style and substance here, because the argument is basically the British Empire was flawed, but it was good. Here are the reasons. Yet also somehow it's inherently corrupt, and which would allow the evil internal forces of its own left to destroy it, which is also which was the same argument I used to get from even like alt-rightists who would talk about like defending Western civilization this way. And I was like, well, the liberalism you hate so much is actually clearly a product of capitalism, Christianity, and the things about Western civilization that you think are the most important things. The dog agrees, apparently. And similarly with Hitchens, with Peter Hitchens here, it's like, well, if the enemy was within the whole time, then what are you actually nostalgic for? Yeah, and it also is. He does the thing of quoting Orwell, rightist quoting Orwell. I mean, at least he admits that Orwell was a leftist, but kind of. But then uses Orwell's turn towards social patriotism at the end of his life as like a good thing. And it's interesting also the idea is being stated in a way that if it was said in an American accent, I don't think anyone would take it seriously. That the EU is an
both brothers definitely benefited from that throughout their lives, but yes.
The EU is basically an extension and a more effective form of the Soviet Union, which is wildly hilarious to me, given its origins in the Marshall Plan as part of the Cold War. The
fact that it's in a lot of ways. It's just a bankers club. But yes, there are many ways in which the EU is very unlike the Soviet Union. I think would be safe to say. The Soviet Union also had a much more functional decision-making process. It's flawed in many ways, but they could get together and do things. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a crazy argument. Also kind of funny because even though I certainly think there's a lot to criticize about George Orwell's politics of the Cold War in his last years. Even in those years, he doesn't really match up with what Peter Hitchens is saying. Like, especially even on the EU question, right, which obviously didn't exist. Even the common market didn't. But there is still, there are things that George Orwell wrote, post World War II, where he's like, yeah, ultimately what we need is a socialist United States of Europe. So I don't think he's really Peter's friend on this.
No, I don't think he is either. I think any lingering jingoism in Orwell comes from kind of a romanticization of the British working class. I always think of his second essay on James Burnham, where he's like, the reason why Burnham doesn't understand the virtues of the working class is he's not British and doesn't have our working class, which just makes me like fall over laughing. But in general, what seems to be motivating Orwell is the fear of Stalin, and and like you said, there's rightful stuff to critique because he turned in people to intelligence and tried to get them blacklisted, who we would now know were not particularly Marxist-Leninist diehards. So.
Yeah. I will say I think that's a little overstated. I think that my understanding is that, like, basically while Orwell was on his deathbed, somebody who was part of some, I don't know if it's MI5, MI whatever, basically like the British version of like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, that kind of thing. was like consulted him for advice about like people like writers to invite to be part of some initiative like that, and he basically like told them about certain people, like don't hire this person, they're kind of a fellow traveler or whatever, maybe sometimes in a like inaccurate or paranoid way, and you could certainly criticize him for the fact that like he's that buddy with people who are doing things like this in the first place, that like that tells you something about what's wrong with his overall position on the Cold War. But also, I think something gets a little lost in translation. We talk about it as if this were like naming names to, to McCarthy, or, getting people on the Hollywood blacklist or anything like that. My understanding is that in context, it wasn't quite that.
Yeah, mine is similar, although it may have had that effect anyway. It is hard to parse what Orwell was thinking. Also, his his associations notwithstanding, it's just interesting that Hitchens has to appeal to someone like Orwell to do the bait and switch, to while also complaining about the British left not being patriotic enough because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which I'm sure would have been true for the Communist Party of Great Britain, but I don't know that the Communist Party of Great Britain was never particularly. It was not even like the Communist Party of France. It was never particularly powerful. It had no. Labor was seen as a legitimate workers' party in Europe. I mean, in England, and in Great Britain as a whole, and the Communist Party did not emerge from that clearly in the same way. So all that's to say that, I mean, I just think some of his arguments are just patently false, but what I appreciate about Peter Hitchens here, even though I think this is like, you could literally put this in Ben Shapiro's mouth. Someone said this.
Yeah, totally.
And I was like, yeah, you could. It is that level of dumb argument. But Hitchens is a better rhetorician.
Yes,
so
definitely. Yeah, I mean, I actually remember Ben Shapiro saying something kind of reminiscent of this in like late 2019, early 2020, where he basically said that like, if Bernie Sanders was like active in the late 30s, he would have supported the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is like a bizarre thing to say, and very similar to this. It's just, it sounds a lot dumber when Ben Shapiro says it than when Peter Hitchens does, no doubt about that. So yeah, I think that's right. Also, by the way, interesting footnote about this. Martin Amis wrote this, I think, really dumb book called Cobra the Dread, Laughter in the 20 Million, which is, basically like the main thrust of the book is that Stalin was really bad, which is like, yeah, okay, yes, right. I mean, he was, but he's making a lot of weird connections in that book, and he's got this like really like simplistic, flattening anti-communism, and where the subtitle actually comes from is this debate, because Amos attended it, and he says that when Christopher started, he made a joke about old comrades, and everybody sort of indulgently laughed about it, and then he goes off on this big thing about how if he'd been a former fascist and he'd started talking about old brown shirts, nobody would have indulgently laughed about that in Conway Hall, blah blah blah, which along with everything else that's wrong with that, I mean, he does just seem to like basically miss the point that saying like, okay, Christopher Hitchens in the 70s was something that could broadly be described as a kind of communist, and Stalin was something that could broadly be described as kind of communist, but that doesn't really mean that the like Trotskyist sect that the Hitchens brothers were part of back then is somehow responsible for the crimes of Stalin.
Yeah, I mean, weren't they in the SWP?
Yeah, it was the IS back then, but yes.
The IS, which means they Which means they were neutral on the Vietnam War. So, like, you know,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
hardly a Stalinist position.
No, no,
Um,
definitely not. I mean, that was the neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism.
Right.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's an insane thing to say. Also, fun fact though, as you just know, because you just watched this opening statement, I think Martin Amis was kind of misremembering what happened, because even though I'm sure when Christopher starts, he is going to do what he always does, which is the good evening, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, since that's like his shtick, that like even in like 2009, if he was debating some evangelical in front of like a Southern conservative audience, he would still do the comrades and friends thing as like part of his crowd work at the beginning and do it in sort of a jokey way. So I'm sure he does say that at the beginning of his opening statement, but it is also kind of funny in light of what a big deal Martin Amis makes about people indulgently laughing at Christopher referencing his misbegotten, his Trotskyist youth, that was actually Peter. Like,
Yeah, that's hilarious, actually.
says the comrades thing at the beginning. They were always comrades. Conway Hall. All right,
Yeah.
we should probably plunge forward.
My dear chap, you have not succeeded in making me proud to be British, because I've been quite proud enough of being English all along. But you have succeeded in making me reasonably proud to be a Hitchens, at any rate. Nonetheless, it's my task to depose you here and cross-examine a little. And I want to ask you first, because I know, and you've just proved, that you choose your words with care and value the language. You say we're met here in Conway Hall, which is named for Moncure Conway, the great secularist and rationalist who wrote the finest biography of the great Thomas Paine, who started the revolution that we're still continuing, not against the Hanoverians exactly, but against some of their habits of mind and assumptions of rule, trying to re-export the ideas of Paine back from the United States, where I think no one would deny that they planted the real possibility of a constitutional republic. And in your book you say, and I'm proud to be in this hall, in a hall named for him. I've been to many dreadful sectarian evenings in this hall in my time. Came to have a punch-up with the fellow travelers at the Ho Chi Minh Memorial meeting. I want to know how much. I want to know how far back all this extends. But you, on page 155, I direct you to. You describe, in the tones in which Evelyn Waugh describes the high insolent dome of Brideshead. By the way, Mr. Waugh noticed children with faces of ageless evil, even in Scoop.
Are you going to make this question?
Yes, I am. Which showed that the discovery of juvenile delinquency.
Weather forecast in a minute. You have to hurry.
I think might show the discovery of juvenile delinquency is not a new one. But you say of our great national institutions, great fortresses that withstood Tom Paine and the Luftwaffe. Would you now want to take that back?
No.
Then would you like to justify it?
Yes, National Socialism has the same root as all other socialism.
Prolonged and stormy applause of the Stalinist.
There are some places where it's good not to get it. It's okay, don't worry.
Okay, well, I know when I'm licked, at least up to a point. Let me ask you another question. I'll make this one quick, or terse, or pungent, as Mr. Humphreys would probably say. I think it's on page 308. I don't actually have the note in front of me now. You say that it really was a terrible mistake, and that the United States decided to halt what you describe as the British, but was in fact an Anglo-French, actually cooperating with continental snail and horse-eating types, I might add. Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt in 1956. You say it was a terrible thing that invasion was stopped by General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower. Do you hold to the view that the Suez invasion is the sort of thing for which we should be nostalgic?
I don't think many people would say that the Middle East was a better place as a result of the vacuum which resulted from the failure of Suez than it would have been if we hadn't successfully intervened. No.
I'm wondering if I'm allowed a supplementary.
One more.
No, I think I'll let that stay as a statement. Golly is all I can say.
Well, in that case, you can do your 10-minute comment.
One more. Do you think it's a sort of invasion of privacy, or a kind of rape of everything we've ever held dear, or as they used to say in Private Eye, everything we've held most often? That citizens, or if you prefer subjects, anyway, residents, legal residents of these islands can now, if thwarted in a search for justice or redress here, take their case to the European Court of Human Rights and overturn a British denial of that.
I think it's very peculiar that people should expect better justice from a court made up, in many cases, of retreads from communist Eastern European regimes than they would in their own courts, yeah.
That'll do it. Your turn.
Well, I think I can, well, that also means, I might add, ladies and gentlemen, comrades, friends, brothers and sisters, that I can be brief in my rebuttal, because I think those were clarifying answers. I think you'll agree. When I had a debate down the road at the Central Hall, Westminster, a few years ago with Alan Clark, the late Alan Clark, who Peter hopes to replace in Parliament, and I must say I wish him well. I think that Kensington and Chelsea Conservatives would be mad to pick anyone else if they want to put the fear of the risen Christ into the Blairites.
I think that's an endorsement.
And everybody
I'm not sure there are many of them here, though.
Everybody knows why they wouldn't be frightened of Portillo, and everyone can see it. Anyway, I finished my debate with, I was astounded by what Clark said, I must say, and the way he talked and what he seemed to look forward to. This was about 5-6 years ago, and I ended my own peroration in rebuttal by saying that what Alan Clark seemed to beckon forth for what remained of Ukania, because our country, as you know, doesn't have a name yet, which is one of the reasons why it's not quite a nation and not quite a state and not quite a community either, but United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is not the name for a country, it's the name of an expired political compromise. And those of us who are quite happy to think of ourselves as English or Englishmen abroad, in saying that manifest, I think, a certain confidence rather than the lack of confidence that appears to be offered in the reaffirmations of John Bullishness that are now being peddled to us. So it looked to me as if the Clark future would be, for these islands, would be that of a sort of resentful, morose, offshore Serbia. The sort of country that resented interference in its internal affairs, if you remember the expression. The sort of country that had a romantic and disordered attitude to its own past and a horrific suspicion of paranoia about its own neighbors, and indeed even about some of those who live within its borders. The evocation of Serbia wasn't as toxic then as it's become since. I mean, I was more right than I knew about what Serbia's dwelling on its past glories would lead to. So I was there, but I was still very impressed as we went down the steps of Central Hall. Alan Clark did that thing he could do and I can't, putting the hands behind the back and so naturally falling into step with you. It's a military trick, I think, that I don't possess. And putting his head down and saying, also another gift he had, of speaking quite firmly to you without anyone else being able to hear. He said, rather clever of you to have spotted the Serbia analogy, he said. A lot of us chaps rather admire Johnny Serb. At least he knows. At least he knows what he stands for. He's prepared to stick up for it. Well, I'm not going to say where I think all that has led or could lead, and I don't think in an audience like this, I have to. I, of course, must ask myself, I'm obliged to ask, could it be that Clarkey was joking, or was it another case of a true word spoken in jest? This is the kind of speculation that Peter spares one. You know he means it. There isn't any of that. Carry on with him. Now, I've not come here, as I hope those of you who've known me for a bit will trust, to offer any counsel of complacency. Don't believe in counsels of complacency. But I have a short list of things that have never worried me in the least. It's never worried me in the least that the Conservative Party is not reactionary enough. I've never lost a wink on that. It doesn't bother. I've never worried at all that I'm going to wake up and find the Labour Party's become too radical. It's just not worth the time. In fact, I would say the Labour Party was now the Conservative Party at prayer. In fact, I don't think there's ever been a better time to be a reactionary in this country. I think there's this almost positive ingratitude in some of Peter's allocutions. It's never bothered me. I've never thought, my God, is the monarchy going to become too populistic? It's never worried me. I've never thought, geez, is the Church of England absurd enough yet? And for the reasons I just gave, because I feel the confidence that all Englishmen are born with, even if they come from parents or parentage that's partly non-English and refugee, never really bothered me that the name, the Ukrainian name, the compromise name, the name of a historic compromise, an exhaustive historic compromise, might become a bit more disunited. I feel I can live with that. I have friends who are known Welshmen. The odd Scot.
Steady on that.
I know. And you know, the other thing, I've never since the first time I tried to fight my way to Paris, that I thought this channel should be a lot wider. It's too bloody narrow the way it is now. None of these things bother me in the least. And what therefore may disqualify me from even being here, because one should have a natural sympathy. One should be able to put the other side's case in theory, as one used to do in the Union and so forth, as a duty. One should be able to phrase their case as well as possible, as if it was one's own. There are bits of this that I just don't get. I've got many disagreements with Peter, as I hope I've delineated and will continue to delineate, but the chief one is this. He writes, and his book is very good, I think, and I agree with very much of what he says about the junk culture of the country and the spread of trashiness and showbiz values and so forth. And his chapters on that are the best, though if challenged, I have some corrections for him about Philip Larkin, D.H. Lawrence, and Seller and Yateman's 1066 and all that. But these can be the mistakes of haste. He's right about a lot of that. But he writes as if it's all been very sudden and very brutal and very abrupt, as if one morning we woke to find that thieves in the night had taken our nationhood and our freedoms away from us, as if this crisis was of very recent provenance. Now, it seems to me that almost everything that's happening now, that's being debated now, is long, bloody overdue and has been allowed to rot and decay as an argument, as has been stalled and congested for far too long. It was my current affairs master at my prep school who first asked me whether I thought that Harold Macmillan should or should not agree to join what was then the European Common Market, it was then called, having evolved from the coal and steel agreement between France and Germany. People now ask you this with a sort of nursery freshness, as if, you know, could one get on better terms with the immediate continental neighbors? As for the constitutional questions, it astounds me, even looking back over my own political life, how little time the left used to spend on looking at what was obvious in the constitutional impasse. It was obvious in Macmillan's time that there was in this country what I think one could, though it would involve borrowing a foreign phrase, describe as an ancien régime. And that the existence of this regime and its unexamined reserve strength, unelected, unaccountable powers was what prevented many people from even discussing what might be the matter. An institutional sclerosis, in fact, though I apologize to any sclerotics who may be present. Now, the chief interest of Peter's book, and I would say its chief merit, is its extreme candor, therefore, about Thatcherism. Some hardened old comrades will recognize what I mean when I say the Nairn-Anderson theses, right, about the long crisis of the British state and establishment. It was quite clear to some of us on the left that if the Labour Party refused to take on the institutional crisis of the ancien regime, that someone, it wouldn't just remain unsolved, there wouldn't be stasis. Someone would arise to take it up and break it. And of course, that was Mrs. Thatcher. Call her Baroness as much as you like, she'll always be Mrs. Thatcher to me. And she was willing to quarrel, as you'll remember, willing to quarrel as no Labour Prime Minister ever was, with the House of Lords, with the Inns of Court, with the syndics of Oxford University, with the Church of England, with the Bank of England, and above all with the consensus that existed between British capitalism and the barons of the trade union hierarchy. All these institutions that Labour had left untouched in a kind of holy awe. You can't go there, you can't mention any of that. That's all off limits. Like the Labour Chancellor, Philip Snowden, I believe it was, in the 1930s, who, when asked after the collapse, why didn't you devalue the pound? He said, well, no one told us we were allowed to do that. Not only that, but Mrs. Thatcher, within 2 months of being elected Prime Minister, had settled the question of the independence of Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. And within not many months after that, had signed the Hillsborough Agreement, which in effect ceded the crucial point of sovereignty in Northern Ireland. Up until then, the absurd position of Enoch Powell that the Republic of Ireland had no more right to be consulted about the 6 counties than Belgium did, which was his stated view. Another case where his reason drove him mad was the official view. She dumped it. This was no Labour Foreign Secretary or Home Secretary would have touched these things in that way. So it's very honest of Peter to say that the real problem is Thatcherism, because if you are really, he gives up the honourable title of Conservative. He even repudiates the, I think, dishonourable title of Tory. He wants the mantle of reaction. And if you're a real reactionary, you do have to say that Thatcherism is the problem. And that Evelyn Waugh was right, and that the real disgrace is the clock hasn't been turned back. My only difficulty with that, not my only one, my main one, the one I'll settle on, is not so much whether we should argue about whether it should be turned back or whether it could. I just simply believe that it can't. But the revolutionary element in Thatcherism, its confrontation with the ancien regime, in other words, is still a hinge event of our politics. And now the reactionaries are faced with the consequences of Tory revolution, which they know they can't blame on political correctness. Now, it seems to me as plain as day that the old Toryism, the Toryism that was the summa of which was the status quo in Northern Ireland and Southern Rhodesia, in both of which I spent considerable amounts of time, is irretrievably over and dead by its own hand. Isn't it also plain that the remaining institutional integuments, of which those were extrusions, the monarchy, the Privy Council, which I still believe as a small reform could at least decently be called the Secret Council if we're going to speak English and honour our native tongue. Just call it the Secret Council and see what happens to your perspective. The Privy Council, the Lords, and the confinement of Scottish and Welsh and Irish affairs to grand committees or to police control are dysfunctional. They just don't work anymore from the establishment point of view. They've simply, as Americans would say, ceased delivering. They don't fucking work and haven't for a long time. And as the founder of Charter 88, I'm glad to see some signatories of that. I'm one of the original signatories here. I've thought that that's been obvious to a lot of people for a long while. The partition of Ireland, for example, as with the other British imperial partitions of the subcontinent, of Palestine and of Cyprus, has had nothing but calamitous and sectarian effects, and as with all these partitions, will lead either to another partition or another war, or both. And the sooner that this difficulty can be adjusted, the better. And who is to say that this has suddenly been sprung upon us by a conspiracy within the establishment? Who is really going to say that the contrary is not true, that we've been putting off this question and many others for far too long, and are now living with the consequences of that promiscuous, idiotic, institutionally conditioned ancien regime procrastinations? I'm approaching, I know what you're thinking anyway. Now these changes, institutional and social ones, need some delicate management because they are capable of setting people against one another and of arousing jealousy and resentment and so forth. They need, in other words, careful handling. We don't want borders to be redrawn between Wales and England or Scotland and England. And we don't, it's nice to take water for a change. And we don't want, of course, a redrawing of the jagged boundaries of the partition, not just Ireland, but Ulster, as Punjab and Kashmir And Bengal had to be partitioned to partition the subcontinent, double partitions. There needs to be a form in which the centripetal and the centrifugal can be carefully handled. It's also seemed to me for a long time to be self-evident that the form, the political context in which that could take place must be European. Because where is the solvent? Where was the real solvent of the border question between Britain and Ireland if it was not the fact that both Britain and the Republic of Ireland became members of the same customs union? At once the border began to look absurd and has become to look more absurd ever since. Why is it that Scottish and Welsh forces can ask for independence and for autonomy now, knowing that they can deal with Brussels as well as London? How else could it have been? That's the only way, in other words, that it wouldn't be mere nationalism. It is the European context that has prevented the Catalan and Basque questions in Spain from becoming tribal and stop them from being as tribal as they were, because there is a context in which there's another court, as there is, even for us humble subjects, if denied justice, we can go to a court in Europe of the kind that Peter slandered. So that to me, the political question is the crucial one about Europe, the centrifugal balance, the two, allowed Greece, Portugal, and Spain in my lifetime to, with confidence, get rid of their dictatorships, knowing as all intelligent citizens in those countries did, they would never be allowed into the European family if it were not if they retained their dictatorial or despotic mode of government. The rules of the community forbid the admission of dictatorships or any but parliamentary democracies. It is also this that prevents Hungary and Romania from contesting Transylvania now. Both of them want to be members of the European Union. They will not be allowed to import a tribal quarrel into the European Union. They are on good behavior for that reason. There is even a possibility that the filthy consequences of British policy in Cyprus can be undone by careful European handling of Greek-Turkish relations. And what does the right wing say? We don't want to do business with foreigners. We don't want them interfering in our internal affairs. We reserve the right to say to the extraordinarily sober and disciplined and decent and conscientious political class in Germany, we don't know how lucky we are to be dealing with such people. We reserve the right to daily visit upon them the crudest and most vulgar and hateful insults. And we reserve the right, as Mrs. Thatcher did the other day, to reward their patience and Europeanism. A country that openly says we want a Europeanized Germany, not a Germanized Europe. We want to enlarge Europe, so to speak, to restrain ourselves, to contain ourselves and our history, to speak of them in the most spiteful and nauseating terms, and to say that only English-speaking countries have played a civilized role in Europe in this century. Where does this arrogance come from? How is this demagogy permitted? This is the British version of fascism. I think there must be many people living in Holland now and Belgium. Well, I'll just say this, John. Maybe very many people living in Holland and Belgium still to this day who could have done without the Anglo-German naval agreement of 1934, which allowed the Nazis to build a gigantic fleet and encouraged their own rearmament. I think there is a hideous, I make the direct allegation that there is a hideous, vicarious superego at work in the minds of the late Alan Clark, after all, a tremendous Germanophile, of the Tory historians like Chalmley and the others who have a secret admiration, actually, for the Germany that Britain defeated. And they're venting this buried and disgusting memory of the behavior of their own party and their own class now, in an attempt at reviving the cheapest form of xenophobia and chauvinism. And I would really feel awful if any member of any branch of our family had anything to do with anything like any of that, okay?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
That's a takedown. Although it's interesting as a takedown to parse some of what Hitchens is, Christopher is actually hitting Peter on, because while I like a lot of what he gets him on for his superficial British nationalism, I have to admit Christopher seems way too sanguine about what Europe actually is.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I liked, you know, I liked the the list of things that don't keep him up at night. You know, I think that some of the historical stuff was good, but his position on the EU, I mean, is just kind of like, I don't know. I mean, it's just seems like this like really naive, rosy-eyed kind of liberal view of what the EU is. I mean, like I think that it would be. I mean, granted, obviously Christopher's politics did not stay in place. Even in the remaining 12 years that he lived, but like would be interested to see what whether he would have still said these things after I mean after like the crisis in Greece.
Yeah, I would be interested in seeing it as well. I mean, I don't I don't think he would have become a Lexiter, but the idea that you would present the German collaborators in such a lovely view is odd. Also, I mean, there is also something that you can see that in Peter's admiration for the political action of Thatcher, not Peter's, Christopher's adoration.
Christopher,
yeah, where you could see how he would turn later, because even though he's not praising Thatcher for what she did, except in a few cases where it's ironic that she did it by standing up mostly to her own party, he is praising her for actually radically taking on certain elements of staid upper class British society, which the Labour Party would not do in the 70s.
Right.
But there is a way in which that admiration for that almost veers into admiration for what Thatcher did across the board, even when he's calling her reactionary now in the context of 1999.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I think that there's a way in which even though, like you said, I mean, the only things that he's praising her for doing are things where she's like backing off from like really hardline British imperialist positions. Just the fact that he's willing to have this weird, ambiguous, like soft spot for Margaret Thatcher because she like shook up the status quo, basically. I mean, there's definitely a at least on a mindset level, right? I mean, there's definitely a little premonition there of like his view on post 9/11 foreign policy, right? I mean, like it's kind of the same, it's kind of the same spirit. That's like, okay, well, the way the established order sucks so bad that like whatever's going to come along to change it, I kind of like.
Yeah. I think that is sort of what's going on there, and it's interesting to see, because I do think you see hints of where he's going to go, and you see the weaknesses in his argument. But you want to talk about master iteration? I mean, because we just watched Peter, who's by American standards is amazing, and then you watch Christopher, who starts off letting them heckle him, is very conciliatory, and he does end basically by soft implying that his brother would be a Nazi sympathizer. Like, someone in the chat recognized that too, and I was just like, did he just accuse him of being a soft Nazi? I think he just accused him of being a soft Nazi. Yeah,
no, that's Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and Christopher does know what he's doing enough that like that lands so much harder because he spends like even when he's asking him his questions, after Peter's opening, I mean, he spends so much of his time, um, yeah, being conciliatory and praising him, for at least his rhetorical abilities and like the really like the first few minutes, it seemed like he was like trying to search for all the nice things that he could possibly say about Peter,
Mhm.
from his perspective, and then he sort of moves into like gently poking fun at him with the stuff about how he's not going to lose over any sleep over the Labour Party being too radical, and the Church of England not being absurd enough, and and all that. And then, yeah, as it goes on, with all the stuff about Johnny Serb, and then reaching back to World War II, it gets nastier and nastier.
Mhm. Yeah, it's remarkably subtle how it works. Um, I mean, one thing that's interesting about these debates is how formal they are, because
Uh
when
huh.
we compare them to what we normally see, which are, I guess, kind of Lincoln Douglas style debates, often they're just almost like the political debates where it's just response, 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 response. These are very prepared, uh, almost theatrical pieces, and they don't get a lot of direct at each other. But it was interesting how Hitchens was able to use the questions in the beginning in a very wise way and still come up with what is a very structured um, counter argument. Just from the standpoint of a rhetorician. Now, and points of logic. Um, if we were viewing this debate purely on logical grounds, neither one of them have actually landed that much. I mean,
Uh huh.
there are good historical points being made by by Christopher Hitchens here, um, that are more realistic. Like there's more actual history being mentioned than the kind of gloss that Peter gives. But there's not a whole lot of logical debate. And like I said, from the viewpoint of 2021, some of what Christopher Hitchens, man, it's going to be confusing. Christopher Hitchens is saying about contemporary politics is just wrong. Like, but I don't know that you could have not known all that in 1999. Although
Yeah.
it's funny that you could have known that basically Brussels and Germany were just a gang of central bankers. Like that was pretty clear by, like, say, 1995,
Yeah.
and the EU general hostility towards local democracy was also beginning to be established by the late 90s.
Yeah, I think, yeah, right. And I also think that, okay, so we talked about the way that the Thatcher stuff kind of foreshadows where Christopher would ultimately go, but I think there is also a way in which his EU position in this debate does,
Mm-hmm.
because um, I'm not sure if it's in the remaining part of the debate per se, or it's in the Q&A, but I mean that there is a point here where I think Peter, and then I think somebody in the Q&A like presses him on the democratic deficit stuff, which is obviously the biggest flaw in his position, and he sort of says, well, we're going to need to have a struggle for democracy anyway. It's better to do it within Europe. But it's like, it's so vague, right? This idea that someone or other is somehow or another struggling for greater democracy. Like the idea of like the working class as a historical agent is really, I think has by 1999 has like largely faded from Christopher's worldview. And so given that, right, like, all right, he has all the things that he doesn't like, uh, like all of the sort of uh, conservative and jingoistic and regressive aspects of English society in the EU case, or like you know right wing authoritarian regimes in the Middle East in the post 9/11 case, and because he doesn't like the sort of old style socialist view about how historical change might happen that he would have once had, I think is faded. I mean, he's kind of casting around for alternative change agents. So it's like, well, maybe at least like the EU could impose some good human rights laws on Britain. Maybe ultimately, right? Maybe the 82nd Airborne can bring democratic revolution, to the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean that does seem to be where it is heading. Is this idea that in lack of there being some kind of class subjectivity, that all you have is a literally idealist conception of human rights, and whatever institution you could possibly find that could have an international backing to support it. That's it. And I mean, I think we forget now in the post-Occupy like Renaissance talks about all kinds of collective actors, focuses on identity groups and stuff like that. But none of this seemed to be in the air in 1999. I mean, I think people forget about that. But the Soviet Union's only gone, what, 7 years?
About that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not clear what China's doing yet. And so I do think we need that. To me, part of Christopher's context is that his real souring on standard liberalism emerges at the time of the collapse of any kind of alternative left to that liberalism. And we yes, there were radicals in the academy. Yes, there were anarchists. Yes, the SWP IS tradition existed. Yes, there were a few socialist groups, but none of these socialist groups, even in Britain, were larger than 5,000 people. And this was a particularly bad period for that. And Hitchens starts that off. I think what's interesting is Christopher realizes that when he says that this is one of the best times to be a reactionary, that in a way he's turning to this liberal internationalism, in a proto neoconservative way, partly because he doesn't have an answer out of this seeming reactionary period of the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, no, I think that is, I think that's exactly right. All right, let's see Peter's questioning.
First of all, a small point about the name of the country. It seems to me to do us some credit that we call ourselves the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Were we some other countries I could think of, we might not call ourselves the United, what shall I say, Reich of Germany and Western Poland, or perhaps the United Reich of Germany and Northeastern France, or the United Reich of Germany and Austria, or the United Reich. Have I left anywhere out? They never troubled. Yes, they never troubled. They never troubled with such nonsense. It was always the Großdeutsche Reich, and that was it. The reason why we call ourselves that name is we are there is nothing. Is it that you appear obsessed with the doings of the Privy Council, a body which has vestigial
Yeah, that's odd. Wonder how long this lasts.
The European Commission is not.
The European Commission is, and nobody noticed. That it can actually call itself the Secret Council, and nobody knows.
Well, I'm not sure what's going on there, but I think it's at least clear in context that what he was asking was something like, "Why are you obsessed with these vestiges like the Privy Council?" And instead of like being obsessed like I am with like the power of European institutions over the UK.
Right.
Notice because it's in, so to speak, Norman French. That's all I was talking about. Now, there are lots of outfits that whose deliberations I'm not allowed to invigilate or attend or know of. Bank of England governors is one. European Commission is certainly another.
BBC Board of Governors.
The Board of BBC Board of Governors would be another. There'd be, and of course, of the Board of no multinational corporation will admit me to take its minutes. So
yes, but you're missing the point. They're all under the scrutiny of the Parliament, which you can elect and dismiss. The European Commission is not.
Actually, well, then it's the matter of whether you'd scrutinise Parliament by select committee. But there is a European Parliament, which it is true. Well, wait, there were times when this Parliament of ours had not gathered to itself the powers to invigilate the absolutist rulers of this country, and it's certainly true, it seems to me, it's commonplace on the left to say that the European Parliament must acquire and take unto itself powers of this sort and mount a struggle of that kind. But it is on that terrain that the struggle will take place. And you want to move it back across the cliffs and under the...
Another question, Bill.
No, just one. You said you never wished the channel to be wider. Wouldn't you have preferred it to be wider in 1940 than it was?
No, absolutely not. I mean, well, for two reasons. One is it's now, I think, been conclusively shown that there was never going to be an invasion. None was meditated. And the other is that if there was going to be one, I think you quote the man who reassured Parliament about the Bonaparte. Said, "I do not say, my lords, that they cannot come. I say only that they cannot come by sea." Well, that wasn't the way they were going to come. There was no other explanation for the thing. And all the new work on that period shows that there was no plan for it either. No, I'm sorry, I'm not going to turn into Vera Lynn even to please you.
That's a great relief, I have to say. One more quick one.
Okay, one quick one. On the Irish question, you say that the joining of what you call a customs union by both countries made the border irrelevant. Isn't it rather odd that the border wasn't fairly irrelevant already, given that the two countries actually have effectively a common citizenship in which both can live and work and vote in each other's countries and for each other's parliamentary elections, and passports are not required for travel between them? Surely the issue is much more that the European Union sought to interfere in the relationship between two sovereign countries.
No, I would say not. You're right to add that there were already solvent effects on the border. And you would have been right if you'd said the border was an absurdity, an impossibility in the first place, and was drawn only for sectarian reasons, which shamed those forces of the crown that did it, that committed it. But no, it seems to me, looking back on the way that the absurdity of the situation in Ulster became manifest was about the time that the Republic of Ireland era, the Free State, whichever you want to call it, became a member also of the European, then of the EC. The fact is that these are prefigurations that you mentioned. We hope soon, we hope devoutly that very soon it will be possible for all Europeans to have that same relationship. As for interference, no, somebody had to help save the British from the Enoch Powell view that no one had any right to discuss the 6 counties but the Privy Council, that no one had any right to discuss it who was even Irish, particularly if they were Irish, and that it was interference in our internal affairs to mention it, because there was the Serbianization of the question staring one directly in the face. I think we should be grateful to those in Europe and in the United States who saved the British government from its own folly in Ulster.
Right, thank you. Questions from you? Yes. Can we, incidentally, if they're going to be speeches, make them very, very, very short speeches? I mean, preferably no speeches, but if you have to make a speech, make it a short one. Yeah, back there.
Planning to put into effect the first bricks and paving stones of Corpus Juris
BBC actually did an interview on the subject last Sunday afternoon at 12:45. So there we are. If you'd watched that instead of reading your documents, you'd have known. But there we are. Off you go.
Peak time is over for the
Peak
important
time,
subject.
precisely. Peak time for the people.
I think it's an absolutely corking question. And I would sincerely like to see the documentation. And I have some people I'd want to show it to.
All right.
But it's so far, it does come as news to me.
All right, we usually skip the Q&A anyway. It just transitioned very quickly into it, and I wanted to see what that guy was yelling about. Which is, as far as I know, you know, there are many good criticisms of the EU. I think that probably is not you know, is not one of the many good criticisms that would have held up, unless I misunderstood what the guy was yelling. It doesn't help also that he was sort of exactly like what you would imagine from like from the sort of like belligerent middle-aged English person like yelling at a meeting about the European courts.
Yeah, I mean that sounds pretty par for the course. I suppose what we're left with is a very unsatisfying position where I kind of feel like rhetorically Christopher wins.
Yeah,
but both sides are actually kind of in a precarious place, because I must admit when Peter hits back on the non-democratic nature of the EU and the fact
That's
that
got a
the European Parliament doesn't really have much binding power for anything, and thus is like a sideshow for probably some of the weirdest politicians in Europe to be manifest, because no one thinks it's super important. He's got a point. Like he does have a point. Now his other point about like Nazi Germany and you know I don't, you know, I get tired of argumentum ad Hitlerum from both sides, but particularly from the right. But that point's pretty weak. It's like, well, the Germans wouldn't have recognized. Well, if someone had made them, they probably would have. So it's a very interesting situation. Also, I think you know, the stuff about Serbia is being debated in the chat. I think the Serbianization of the UK is. I mean, what's interesting is it does seem like it's somewhat inevitable now. It's hard for me to imagine how, like, devolution looks more and more likely. Maybe not with Wales, but definitely with Scotland, and maybe with Northern Ireland, particularly given the hardship Northern Ireland's likely to face with the hard border close. So it does seem quite like, in one sense that metaphor makes sense, but in another sense it doesn't really. Like, Scotland is not going to be going in to do ethnic cleansing of all the English within its borders. I mean, you just
no, it's a ridiculously overheated analogy. I mean, it's tricky, I think, in general, because I think the EU question, you know, what would later become the Brexit question, is like, in a way, it's kind of a poison pill for the left, because
both
like
options are concessions to different kinds of right wing. Like, really, like, if you're completely, because Brexit's a concession to what we're seeing with Boris Johnson, and it's a concession to a kind of right wing nationalism, and in the UK, and there is no way around that. But it's also one that has not helped. If you're seeing conditions in England, has not helped the average English working class, even though it has hurt English capital. So that's fun. But and the other sense, like if you're defending the EU too vociferously, and I think this is what doomed Corbyn even, which he didn't defend the EU, but he was in an impossible situation. He put himself in an impossible situation and responded in a milquetoast way, frankly, which I do think is probably the driving thing that cost him the election.
Question. Yeah.
Yeah,
because he was. Yeah, I mean, because I mean, for one thing, I think it was extremely obvious that the sort of positions the Labour Party was coming up with on Brexit were like, I mean, yeah. So he campaigned for a name, but didn't really seem like his heart was in it. Understandably, right, for all the reasons that we've been talking about, his heart wasn't really in it. Which is not to say that Leave, was like clear. I mean, look, if you had. Like if there was like a left-wing Labour government in power and they could just dictate the terms, then yeah, I think there's definitely a case for Lexit, to be made. But under those circumstances, do you really want to leave? It's not clear to me. But like obviously his heart wasn't in staying in the EU, and then they came up with this series of positions that like just reeked of being awkward compromises between factions with like incredibly opposed positions on it. So I mean, look, it's about as close as any probably modern British election has been to being totally single issue. That election where Corbyn crashed and burned, and on that single issue, the Labour Party had nothing coherent to say. I mean, they just sound. I mean, they just sounded like what they were, which is that they were kind of trying to come up with something to say that wouldn't piss too many people off.
That's exactly what happened, and in retrospect, that damned them. And I think that we already see that in our responses to this debate, because we're like, well, the British national answer that Peter wants. I mean, and his reactionaryism, I think, comes off the clearest when he's talking about drugs or when he's talking about Northern Ireland. He didn't talk about drugs in this one, but that's when it's really clear that like his Britain is like, we got to support the Protestants against the Catholics, because we got to support the Church of England, and this, that, and the other. Whereas Christopher just kind of waves away the question, and it sounds like he's talking with starry eyes. I mean, about the EU, the way he would later talk about NATO. Like,
no, for sure, yeah. I mean, and like again, there's this sort of vague concession to how, there's going to have to be some sort of struggle to make European institutions more, more like democratic. But that's also a weird position to take if you're enthusiastic about integrating Britain more thoroughly with currently not very democratic versions of them.
Right, exactly. Like the EU is not a very democratic. It's basically a bureaucratic operation, and it's basically at the interest of a very conservative set of central bankers, frankly, even more conservative than the American branch. So it is hard to see what the benefit of this actually was, which also I think maybe a little bit why, if we're completely honest, Christopher doesn't really deal with British politics much after this time period. He mostly focuses on American.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and I think he has, yeah, and I mean, I think to a great extent, his main focus was always, well, his main focus probably was always mostly on, I mean, not obviously when he was writing for the New Statesman in the 70s or whatever, but like, from the 80s onward, he probably spent most of his time on American politics with a particular emphasis on foreign policy. Although, he was writing great stuff, like the anti-Clinton years when he's writing great stuff about the death penalty and welfare reform and healthcare and all of that. But yeah, I think you can see, right? Like in some ways it was kind of easier for him in the American case because the like in a weird way, I think it might have actually been easier for him to support, the Republican president, waging these wars in the Middle East than it would have been if like Clinton was still in office. But like, yeah, Tony Blair he did have to do a weird 180 on
Mhm.
that. Like, you know, there's a piece he wrote, I think, for the Guardian in like 2001 that's called like Mick Labor. It's about all of the like corporate branding, you know, endorsements and stuff, the Labor Party conference. But then he does this debate with Tony Blair about religion, you know, at the very end of his life. You know, he's chemo bald, and he like says nothing but positive about, you know, Tony Blair as like a statesman or whatever, you know. So, but yeah, I agree. I mean, I think he probably had, you know, very little. You know, I think he had very little that was you know, compelling to say about British politics in the 2000s. So he, you know, he pretty much stayed out of it. I mean, there is an interesting question to be asked about where he would have gone, you know, like if he'd beaten cancer in 2011, you know, where like how his politics would have continued to evolve after that, and like what positions he would have taken in the Trump era. And I think the most depressing plausible answer to me is that he would have just become like the really annoyed resistance lib, and so that would have at least given him a story to tell about both the U.S. and Britain.
Yeah, well, you know, I think maybe he would have been maybe even close to what a Lincoln Project resistance lib, not even like not even an annoying Democratic one. I think that's clearly where it would have gone, and it's hard to know where he would have. I mean, some of his positions are obscured by his associations. Like, he was never a particularly strong supporter of Israel ever, including during his neoconservative period, which I think most people don't realize because they associate him with positions held by Bill Maher or by Richard Dawkins, which are more Zionist. Actually, Richard Dawkins' Zionism is a little hard to say, but in general,
yeah. I mean, Christopher, like 2000s Christopher is an incredibly weird, ambiguous hodgepodge of positions. Like
right.
You know, yeah. I mean, he's like, yeah. There's a clip I remember we watched on TMBS, or actually I don't even remember if I was in that segment, but it was watched on TMBS. Throwback clip of Hitchens, like arguing with Andrew Sullivan in 2002, and you know they both support the impending invasion of Iraq, but a caller asked like, oh, don't you think, you know, credibility about demanding that Saddam Hussein follow these UN resolutions is undermined by like Israel constantly being allowed to violate UN resolutions? And Christopher says yes, and he ends up having this like really intense argument with Andrew Sullivan about it. And that's like kind of typical of a lot of issues, that there are like a lot of places where he still had a lot of his old leftist positions, or at least ambiguous, like watered down versions of them, and which is why I do think it's a little bit of an open question where he would have ended up in later years. I mean, I think it would have been psychologically very difficult, maybe impossible, to walk back the neocon foreign policy positions, but
are the associations with Dawkins and Harris, who were Dawkins' position, I actually don't know. Now I think about it, I don't know if he's ever clearly made. But Bill Maher and oh my God, Sam Harris. If you go through like the End of Faith, like there's an argument where like it's okay to bomb people because of what they might believe because of their association with religion, specifically about Zionism. It's what it's trying to justify, and it's a wow kind of reading. And Hitchens was quiet about that. That was one of the things. Like, yes, he still maintained a good position on this, but he kept his mouth shut when he was talking to even the other four horsemen. So it was one of these things where, and I think it was particularly true about their concern about secularizing the Middle East. What I find interesting is basically the, you know, neocon foreign policy actually probably was the biggest barrier to increased secularization of the Middle East, because it was an extension of late colonial policy, and it really did put the death nail into things like Pan-Arabism.
For sure. I mean, not to even mention, I mean, you know, like certainly, I mean, obviously in Afghanistan, it made parts of Afghanistan temporarily more secular, but it definitely made Iraq way, way less secular.
Right.
Like just in an immediate way.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm even thinking of like Egypt, where the various geopolitical pivots led to like influxes of like Saudi clerics who did all these religious reforms, even under the secular military governments. Whereas under Nasser, you had something like a deliberate attempt of like a modernist reformist Sharia that was highly secular and got rid of. I mean, it was basically, they were trying to basically become like the Reformed Jews of the Muslim world, and that died on the vine because of its association with Pan-Arabism and its inability to stand up to the colonial powers, particularly after actually the Anglo-French American invasion of Egypt, which Hitchens supported. So I mean, it's a hard thing. It's a very hard thing to easily parse out here, and so you leave this going, okay, I can see where maybe Peter Hitchens' politics seem less explicitly reactionary now. You can't watching this, if you know anything about British politics, the extreme level of reaction is undeniable. Like this is a person who basically, like, it has the de Maistre argument about don't call me a conservative because conservatism is always a losing value. I am a reactionary, and we are a counter force of history. Because we're not those weakling ancien regime conservatives. We're counterpower. And like, if you know the history of right-wing thought, that's always a hint of an extreme position. And it's one that, except in very, very specific paleo-conservative quarters, and not even in the most outward parts of it, because Pat Buchanan would never claim this even. You couldn't say in America till about 10 years ago. And so, whereas, Peter softened some of that rhetoric now. Mm-hmm. I think he still believes all of it. Don't get me wrong, but he softened some of it now. He seems to think Britain's like too decayed to fight for in any real sense. That there is no way to, the American politician, political pundit he most reminds me of is somebody who's been forgotten by history because of his racism, but he reminds me of John Derbyshire, but again for religion and not race. Yeah. Like, that's who he reminds me of now, as opposed to back then, where he seems like a very old guard reactionary, like a very old guard reactionary, like a Tory from the 1870s,
Yeah, which in a lot of ways is exactly right. I will say, I mean, obviously I agree with the criticism that, about late Hitchens, being, staying silent on Harris's crazier, Middle East views, which, as we've been talking about, I mean, were even worse, than Christopher's. I mean, I guess Dawkins, to be fair, even though, I mean, I think Dawkins is absolutely an Islamophobe, actually more in some ways than Christopher Hitchens, because
I think a lot more than Christopher Hitchens, frankly. But go ahead.
I think a lot more, because I think that, I think there's a sense in which, I mean, I think the Islamophobia thing with Christopher Hitchens is actually a little ambiguous, because I think that there's a sense in which you could use that term to describe the stuff that he's saying in the War on Terror period, and you'd be right, that certainly, if nothing else, there's like a wildly inflated idea of the realistic threat that Al-Qaeda style terrorism could pose to the West, and also, I mean, I think my bigger criticism, what a lot of my book is spent on, is like the sort of very unmaterialist reading of history about where, religious ideas are the cause of bad things, rather than rationalizing things that happen, for larger historical reasons. But I also think that there's a sense in which people who blame like Christopher's wrong turn on Islamophobia are kind of missing the point, because in certain ways he's really not, like, and also I think that it's just causally. I mean, got to remember, right? The beginning of his warming up to the idea that American military power could be a force for good in the world was not a war where the United States is bombing Muslims. It was a war where the United States was intervening on behalf of Bosnian Muslims, against Serbian Christians, and even a lot of the Iraq stuff, was motivated by, I think the very misguided idea that it would be in the interests of Kurds, who are obviously predominantly Muslim group. So I think that the idea, I wouldn't say there's no Islamophobia in the mix, but I think the idea that like raging Islamophobia is like the central explanation for what happened is implausible. And also just because I think Christopher Hitchens is a lot smarter than Richard Dawkins when it comes to stuff like this. I think Dawkins, I think has a much more simplistic, and I think in some ways just a much more blatant kind of like dislike of Muslims and Islam in a way that's not really about, that I think is sort of over and above his general, his general anti-religious views.
Oh yeah, particularly as he gets older, where he starts like calling for basically renewals of Christian Europe to fight Islam. I mean,
right.
Condell was another of those new atheist figures, specifically UK, who did become, off of that logic, an explicit alt-rightist eventually. So it was not even, that thread was already there. But that's why I was trying to remember Dawkins' stance on Zionism, because I think given his how strident his anti-Islamic take is,
you could see it bleeding into that.
Yeah, you could see it bleed into that, but I don't remember. I can't actually think of an explicit statement. Whereas with like Bill Maher and Sam Harris, they never shut up about it.
Yeah.
So it was.
That's right. Yeah.
And I do remember, I remember reading God Is Not Great, and one of the things about God Is Not Great as opposed to the God Delusion is God Is Not Great. It doesn't try to make a philosophical or scientific argument, but it does go into things that other groups don't go into, which was he goes into stuff about the Tamil Tigers, which I think his interpretation of that is wrong. But I do get where he gets it from. I also think he's soft on the Sinhalese Buddhist army, which is pretty damn violent. And stuff like that. But it's actually, he doesn't make a lot of the same, kind of, because he's not just focused on one kind of religion in the way that the end of faith for Sam Harris is, yes, Christianity is bad. Buddhism may be okay. I don't know. No one ever heard about a Jainist suicide bomber, which fair, I haven't either. I've looked. But Hitchens' book was broader than that. And Harris really, while he was attacking evangelical Christians, his concern was really Islam. And in the end of faith, that was very clear. It's very much a post 9/11 book,
Yeah, in a weird way, God Is Not Great is actually not particularly a post 9/11 book.
No, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only real connection is that I think he's offloading the predictably disastrous consequences of invading Iraq onto this, it's the fault of the parties of God, right? That's the connection with the post 9/11 stuff. But overall, the book is not really about it. I mean, it's about his personal experiences losing his religion. It's about an attempt. I'm not going to say that. I mean, look, I've seen Christopher Hitchens' debate with William Lane Craig. It's not good. Like when he gets into philosophical waters on the actual arguments for and against the existence of God that are particularly deep, he doesn't do well.
Yeah, I was
But
gonna say he's not good at counter apologetics, actually. But
no, he's really not, right? I mean, what he's good at is making this really rhetorically powerful and historically well-informed case about the harms caused by really, I mean, really Christianity mostly, right? And he's good at, and he's also has this like humanistic moral critique of a lot of standard Abrahamic monotheist sorts of beliefs that I mean, it's a very uncool thing to say as a leftist in 2021, but I still find parts of that compelling, right? But like I have, but those are the things that he's good at, right? When he's actually arguing about the existence or not existence of God, it's not very impressive. Like he's, yeah, that's just not what he's good at particularly. But like he really is trying very hard and some of the parts of the book are way more convincing than others, but he's tried very hard to take on the general topic and think about like religion as a phenomenon in general and why he doesn't like religious beliefs and to take on all the standard counter arguments that that people will make in defense of religion as being a beneficial force in the world. And parts of it are way more convincing than others.
mm-hmm.
Like I think his Gandhi was bad actually argument is actually right, and like he's very convincing about that. I think his like religion had nothing to do with Martin Luther King argument is pretty silly, and
yeah, that one's hilarious. Yeah,
and his attempt to blame Stalin on religion is equally silly.
Yeah. The whole Trotskyism is a religion. Also, Stalinism is even more of a religion. And I'm like, really? You're gonna go old conservative on me, because that was the old conservative argument, like imitizing the eschaton, like the von Kuhnlitten stuff. And I'm like, yes. I found it interesting. Actually, I remember at the time I was not yet a leftist when God Is Not Great came out. I found it somewhat interesting that he did at least see that ideology on a spectrum had, what like was on a spectrum of religion, but he never could parse it out. He just basically said one is the other because of its extremity. Have a nice day. And not the more sophisticated anthropological arguments, like religion as a category and ideology as a category are both fungible, and they're kind of on a series of family relationships. If you try to pin down you try to write a definition of religion, we almost always write it in a way that favors Christianity. And if you actually try to apply it to even Judaism, much less something like the Dharmic beliefs or whatever, it starts to fall apart. But then you also start looking at like our philosophical tradition, and like what we're also trying to do is like not make it obvious that the Platonics and Pleistocratics were actually kind of religions. And so there's, we have a reason for the weirdness of our definition, but I get really annoyed with this whole, even though I do think, yes, there is obviously a material relationship between religious culture and the later secular societies that come out of it, because if nothing else, it informed its modes of production and relations of production. But it seems maddening to me to just to do the whole, well, any extreme ideology is really just religion anyway. It doesn't matter if it has God or not. I'm not going to give you an operant definition of how this is religion, because I'm not going to give you an operant definition of religion at all, except that it's bad.
Well, and I mean, he says, like I think the closest he has to like a real historical argument about Stalin is like, well, like the old regime in Russia trained people to be obedient to authority, and that's all bound up with Orthodox Christianity, and that's why, and that's why Stalin could be as successful and dominated Russia as he was. It's like, okay, like first of all, even if all this is true, it would remain the case that this is clearly like a really bad authoritarian regime that is not religious in its like ideological outlook. And secondly, I don't know. I mean, like, despite all this, like Tsarist Russian Orthodox training to obey authority, they did still have a revolution. So, the idea that like you can blame any subsequent, I don't know. It seems like historically, it's a weird, sketchy argument, and it would have been way better if he just said like, if he just admitted that like there could be multiple bad things, and that they don't all have to trace back to religion. I will say he also tries. He has like a very short chapter called like "No Eastern Solution," where he sort of tries to like shoehorn Eastern religions in general into his criticism of Western monotheism, which the entire rest of the book is about. And I mean, it's well written. He scores some real points because it's Hitchens and he's good at this, but also, like there's something just like really thin and kind of silly about it. Like, it's like, okay, really? So like, essentially all non-Western religions are going to be like clumped together in this one extremely short chapter, and you're going to make some like, you're going to make some like critical observations, and that's going to be that case closed. Like, clearly, as if these were like, Buddhism and Christianity and Judaism and whatever, like are all essentially kind of the same thing, which like I think there's probably a better case I think there probably is a reasonable case you could make that some of what's objectionable about Christianity is also objectionable about some versions of Buddhism, etc. But I mean,
Right.
I think the problem is that if you were going to really try to make that case, like there's just no way to make the conclusion quite as sweeping as Hitchens wants to make it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of always the problem to me with the new atheist in general is one, I mean, let's be honest. Like the new atheist, the branding of new atheism was specifically a rebranding from what earlier form of atheism? I mean, they couldn't have been trying to distance themselves from, say, socialist atheism, with that branding.
Certainly the most popular form of atheism beforehand.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
What was this old atheism that no one ever explained what it was? Oh, you had a problem with the humanism of Paul Kurtz, really?
Yeah.
So in some sense, even the framing of a new atheist to me was always like, particularly from I didn't believe this then, but particularly from my standpoint of now, was like, this is some post-Cold War bullshit. But even beyond that,
and it is also worth taking a second to say that, I mean, this goes back to your point about like the how neoconservatism, the invasion of Iraq and all that had these like bad ripple effects for secularism around the Arab world, right? I mean, like, what's the thing that actually led to, like historically, like which made more people secularists in the Muslim world, right? The imported Anglo-American new atheism, or like communism and like left Arab nationalism.
Yeah, I mean, and providing for people so they didn't need all these other institutions. Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious, right, where that goes. And it's been pretty obvious also that while I have met a few Middle Eastern new atheists who are really into people like Ibn Warraq, in general, most of the people who I met were super secular in the Middle East when I was there, were leftist of some variety, or they were pan-Arabist of some variety. Like, those were your real options, and they were rare. I mean, most of that was gone by when I was in Egypt, and it was going away in Turkey when I was there too. But it was there. Now, I will also say one of the uncomfortable things that filled in the void in Turkey was what filled in the void for religion was a racial identity, ironically, largely based on religion. Because what defined who was a Turk and who was a Greek was whether or not you were born in a Muslim
Right.
or Christian community, even though it was a secular movement and largely this was a national consolidation project.
Mhm.
So I think there are problems with, pan-Arabism, devolution into a quasi-racial nationalism is a real problem. Like,
Mhm.
but and you see that clearly, actually, not so much in pan-Arabism, but you see it most clearly in secular Ataturkism in Turkey, which is now pretty much dying as well. And so I think the biggest things that you see from this is just like, well, what would have helped the Middle East out, and what's helping it be more secular now, frankly, and it is pretty much prosperity. It really is the whole.
Right.
And this was my argument even before I was a leftist with a lot of the new atheists. I was like, you won't really. One, I don't think religion's going to go away. Sorry,
Sure.
I
Sure.
wish it would, but I don't
Sure.
think it's going to. But beyond that, it's going to reduce, based on information, education, and development. And then the
Right.
United States, what that ended up being wasn't even like college education. It ended up being the internet.
Yeah.
And Europe, it ended up being vibrant welfare states,
Yeah. Well,
that
that's the
cause
thing, right?
secularization.
Yeah, and it's also probably not a coincidence that the United States has, has like the most, the most miserly, welfare state in the developed world, and is also the most religious country in the first, in the first world. Which is not to say that, like, I mean, look, I think we agree that we could have, like, the Doug Lane vision of what full communism would be, and like religion would still exist because it's just a human thing. It meets certain, like, I think the emotional sources of it, like, run deep enough that, I mean, I don't think we're gonna have a human society, where nobody's attracted to it. I just don't see
Right.
that.
I see. I'm a slightly controversial statement, but the growing belief in astrology and other forms of magic indicate to me that that some kind of religious functionality is not going away under a secular regime, even if the religious institutions do. I just
But
don't.
that said, I think, like, widespread extreme religion, I think, is something that is a response to, adverse conditions, and it is at least plausible that would become way more marginal. With I mean, like, basically in a society where, people, you didn't have, like I always, like, this always drives me crazy, like, when people will defend, like, there's this sort of weird thing that some Americans will do where they'll have this, like, multi, like, sort of weird kind of quasi multiculturalist defense of French, like, aggressive anti-clericalism leading to things like veil bans,
Right.
as
Right.
like, oh, well, that's just the French version of secularism, like don't try to impose your,
Yeah. This
American
is the French
separation.
version of secularism, which also happens to look like secular Catholicism somehow.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, like, this always drives me crazy because it's like, okay, which do you think is gonna lead to, like, if your goal is to make French Muslims as a group on average less intensely religious, like, do which is it that you think is going to do that? Like, making people feel more persecuted? Like is that what's going to do it, right? Making people feel more marginalized and less like part of French society? Or do you think it's, like, maybe, like, greatly decreasing, anti-Muslim prejudice, and also, like, giving people good economic conditions, and like, do you think maybe that is what's actually going to lead to, like, Islamic fundamentalism being way less popular among French Muslims?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the only places where you can look at, despite all the bullshit we've done with our own security state, aimed particularly at Muslims, and having been to Europe and having been to the United States and been around the Muslim community in both, but I can tell you, we offer them more as far as integration goes. Now we also our immigration rules mean we get different kinds of people. There's a bunch of other comorbid factors. I don't want to make it all just cultural because it's not. But one of the things that does tie it in is actually it is material in that guest worker programs are not part of our Muslim immigration scheme, and so people have an incentive to invest in local society. And that is, say, not particularly true, for example, for guest workers in France and Germany, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think, like, even when I'm saying this, there's a material, there's at least a major economic correlate for why there is a difference. But it's one of the few times where the U.S. looks better than Europe. There's not much in which we do. But
no, this is definitely one of them. I mean, I think that this is like people will often. I remember talking about this with Nando a while back when he was on the show. That it's like you got to be careful about how you put this, right? Because like the point is not that the United States is not a really racist society, and that's not a huge problem.
Totally is.
Because like obviously the United States is a very racist society. That's a huge problem here. But like if we're doing comparative racism, like yeah, a lot of these other places are actually way worse. Like that doesn't mean that there's no problem here. You shouldn't worry about it, right? I mean, like it's this is not the kind of thing we should particularly grade on a curve, but like. But I think a lot of American liberals think it's the other way around, and it's really not.
Yeah, to me, this indicates that they haven't spent a lot of time in Europe outside of the metropoles. Right. Like they've gone to tourist destinations. I also think that, I mean, this is true for a lot of places, and I think in the United States, part of the reason why we're aware of our own racism is because we're only we're around 59-60% one kind of ethnicity that we had to invent a racial category so that we would be unified on, like because that's why we bought this whiteness thing so hard, right? Because otherwise we were hating each other for, I don't know, you and I are the wrong kinds of Jews or something, like.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, like, which actually, I mean, to kind of go back to Brexit a little bit, like, is, my sister lives in the UK, and it's been several years since I've been over there, but like every time I always thought it was hilarious, because like everybody would be like, oh, what's the white European ethnic group that everybody's being incredibly racist towards, in the UK, like this visit, right? It's like, oh, is everybody obsessed with like Polish people or Romanians or whatever, which is always funny from an American point of view, because like, to us, right? I mean, that all basically just reads as white.
Right. You have all this anger at Slavs and whatnot, and then there's sometimes a lack of anger at other Commonwealth countries which are not majority white, which just amuses this crap out of me, because both the US and Britain tend to read each other as having the same notions of race, which we clearly don't. And like people may be talking about the idea of whiteness in the context in the United States didn't invent it. It's the most logical. The best argument I find is the Portuguese invented it, and then ironically we excluded the Portuguese from it later, which is hilarious. But that we glommed onto it so specifically because of the needs for unifying a largely immigrant nation, which, while it was mostly from Western Europe and specific, these were Western European countries that had ethnic, even micro ethnic tensions. Because we got to remember, Like Germany wasn't unified yet. Like a whole lot of these countries that we think about immigrants coming from, they were not unified in the modern sense. That's a late 19th century, early 20th century phenomena. So you have people who they're not even not thinking of themselves as white. They're not thinking of themselves as Germans. Like they're thinking of themselves as like Hessians and Prussians and shit.
Right.
So like whiteness comes in to fill the gaps, which is why it's an expanding and contracting category all the time. Like how the Irish became white. Well, they always kind of were, but they never completely were. How the Jews became white. Well, that's a clearer issue, and only some. We're going to be talking about how Latin people have become white or not in the next
well, I mean, that's also
30 years.
Right. Although I will say, I mean, that one's also a little funny to me since I lived in South Florida for so long, and the way that most Americans do that, where like somehow Hispanic, which is a language category, is like definitionally excluded from whiteness. Is, I mean, whatever. I mean, obviously there's no such thing as objectively being white. It's a nonsense category, but like, but it just definitely does not overlap with the way that lots of Latin American immigrants in South Florida see themselves, right? That they, I never, I never ever in 6.5 years in Miami, I never once heard like a light-skinned Cuban person use white as a contrast term to what they were.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I that's probably expanding in a lot of categories, actually. And the reason why I think the reason why that we bring it up, though, is this is one of the things about Peter Hitchens is so weird. Is people with his positions now have largely kind of gone over to ethno-racial nationalism. And Hitchens is still pretty much a diehard Anglican, and all his maybe xenophobia is totally religious based. And it does seem to be like, we can talk about whether there's some deeper problem there, if there's like, that's some kind of code, but I don't think it is actually. With him, it does seem to be.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think he has like nationalistic prejudices, certainly religious prejudices, but I think he actually might be too good a Christian to be really racist. So that's I guess good for him on that. Yeah, thank you, Ethan, for the super chat. Says happy holidays, brothers, sisters, comrades, and friends. Thank you, Straw McCollum and Sock Puppet Account for the earlier ones. Sock Puppet Account is actually a good commenter, but should probably I could keep on talking to Varn about stuff like this, until
we're way off topic now. So.
But I'm not going to do that. This is this has been a lot of fun. Mandatory plug out at the end of the month, and if you order it from Red Emma's, link is in the description. I know they've already started sending out pre-orders. And I actually have an article that's kind of previewing the book that's going to be out in the Nation tomorrow, so check that out. But yeah, where can people find your stuff?
Yeah, they can find me over at Varn Vlog. I'm also a regular guest at This Is Revolution. I have some relationship to Diet Soap Media. I don't work for them. But I have visited over there. I don't have hostile relations with their current project, despite rumors to the contrary. And no, I did not engineer the buyout of Zero Books before anyone.
Did somebody say that?
Somebody, yes, actually, I heard like there's a very. I think it was started as a joke, but people were like, "Wait, he quit." And then 2 weeks later, Zero got bought out. What did he know? And I was like, actually nothing.
If you'd known that, you wouldn't have bothered, right?
I just would have like waited. I would have got one more check. So that's what I've been doing over there. I'm publishing poetry again. I have a book coming out from Mysterioso Press called Liberation and All That Sad, etc. Or All That Bright, etc. Or something. I can't remember the title of my own book because it's too long. But it's Mysterioso Press, it's run by Terry Tapp out of New York. They does stuff on acid communist art, which I don't necessarily consider myself doing, but they think so, so whatever. And so that's all the plugs. If you're into poetry, check it out. If you're not into poetry, probably don't bother. I mean, it's just not gonna, like, if you're not into poetry, it's not gonna be for you. So
yeah, fair enough. All right, well, check all these things out. Watch Varn vlog, and if you yeah, if you can confirm if you listen to the Diet Soap Media podcast that Doug doesn't consider Varn to be any more of an enemy than he always has.
yeah,
So,
our frenemy stasis has maintained what it always has been. So
fair enough. All right, thanks, man.
take care.